On April 7, 1959, Joseph and Elisa Bellino welcomed their fourth child into the world. They named him Brad, and he was the tiniest bundle of joy they had ever laid their eyes on. Growing up, Brad was the baby of the family, surrounded by his two older brothers and an older sister. Despite being the youngest, he had a unique connection with his siblings. Their bond was unbreakable, forged through years of shared laughter, tears, and mischief. From a young age, Brad was always drawn to adventure. He simply had an insatiable curiosity. Whether it was trying new things or exploring uncharted territory, Brad was always up for a challenge. He was very outgoing. We were both risk takers, but he was the one to come up with the risk, and I was the one to go along with it, said Don Templeman, a friend of Brad. Both Don and Brad were in fact very close. It's not clear at what point they became friends, but their friendship likely began after meeting at Boardman Center Middle School, where they both were classmates. Both friends shared a love for adventure, and this kept them inseparable. They would often ride their bikes around town, exploring every nook and cranny they could find. One of their favorite spots was the Boardman Mall, where they would meet up with friends and catch up on the latest gossip. But their thirst for exploration didn't stop there. They were also known to hitchhike occasionally. The two boys were also interested in rocks and would often visit a rock and gem shop that was near Brad's house. Every time they visited, they would lose themselves for hours admiring the breathtaking beauty of the rocks and minerals on display. But it wasn't just their love for adventure that bound them together. They shared a love for baseball and played in a team under the watchful eye of Don's father, who also happened to be their coach. It eventually became a regular occurrence for the two boys to spend the night at each other's houses. Brad and his friend lived just 3 miles apart, making it easy for them to get together whenever they wanted. On Friday nights, Don would head over to Brad's house, where they would go to the cinema. The cinema was just a stone's throw from Brad's home, and the boys would walk there chatting excitedly about the latest movies and the adventures they had planned for the weekend. On Saturdays, the tables were turned and Brad would go over to Don's house at Applewood Acres for a sleepover. The two would spend hours playing games and talking late into the night. Then on Sunday mornings, they would join Don's family for church, an important ritual that brought them all together and strengthened their bond even further. Afterwards, Don's mother usually drove Brad home, and they would say their goodbyes, already looking forward to their next sleepover. For Don and Brad, these weekends were a time of pure joy and friendship, and they treasured every moment they could spend together. The two friends were simply living life to the fullest, enjoying their youth and all the adventures it brought. But then, out of nowhere, something terrible happened that changed everything. School was closed for Easter break on March 31st, 1972, which was just fine with the two friends. At the time, Brad was 12 and Don was 11. As sixth graders, they were eager for some time off and couldn't wait to spend the day together. They soon got together, hit the streets of their small town, and went about exploring as usual. However, the boys' fun day turned into a creepy experience when they noticed a brown van trailing them wherever they went. At first, they thought it was a coincidence, but when they spotted it for the fourth time, their playful mood turned into fear. Sensing danger, they quickly decided to head back to Don's house, hoping to escape the mysterious vehicle's sight. At the time, the sun had also begun to set, so it felt wise to return home and unwind after the long day. But little did they know that their day was far from over. As Brad settled in at Don's place for what was supposed to be a fun night, he quickly picked up the phone and dialed home to let his brother know that he was staying over. A few minutes after this, the phone rang. Brad's heart probably sank as his father's voice boomed through the receiver, demanding that he come home right away. Following this, he reluctantly broke the news to Don that he had to leave and go back home. As fate would have it, Don's mother was at the grocery store when Joseph, Brad's father, called, so she couldn't drive Brad home as she usually did. Meanwhile, Don's father was bedridden with the flu, leaving Brad with no other option but to leave on his own. With darkness setting in and the clock ticking past 7:30 p.m., Brad decided to walk back to his house. He soon bid farewell to his friend. His smile and wave through the door as he left was the last image Don would have of him alive. Meanwhile, Brad's father, Joseph, stayed out late that night, and when he returned from his outing, He had no idea that his son was missing. He assumed Brad had made it back from his friend's house and was sound asleep inside. Exhausted, he went to bed around 2 a.m. Little did he know his world was about to be turned upside down. Brad's mother, Elisa, on the other hand, was away on a work trip to Cleveland on that fateful day, completely unaware of the events that were unfolding back home. The following day, April 1st, 1972, was a Saturday, and Joseph allowed himself the luxury of sleeping in until noon. But as he began to move around the house after waking up, he quickly realized that something was wrong. Brad was nowhere to be found. With growing concern, he dialed the Templeman's home and felt a knot form in his stomach as he heard that Brad had left their house the night before and hadn't been seen since 7:30 p.m. Joseph's heart pounded as he hung up the phone. Where was Brad? He knew he had to act fast to find his son. He rushed out of the house and began scouring the neighborhood, calling out Brad's name. But the more he searched, the more desperate and hopeless he felt. With every minute that passed, Joseph's anxiety grew more intense. By mid-afternoon, he couldn't bear it any longer and dialed the police. He reported that his beloved son was nowhere to be found. The news of Brad's disappearance soon spread like wildfire in the small town. And when Elisa finally arrived home later that evening, she was devastated by the news. She could barely believe what she was hearing. Her son was missing, and despite a search that involved the police and countless volunteers, there was no sign of him. Brad's disappearance soon reached the media, and local newspapers joined in the search efforts. They published a detailed description of the missing boy, hoping that someone would recognize him. He was described as only 4 feet 8 inches tall and weighed just 80 pounds. He had striking blue eyes and short blonde hair that fell just below his ears. The last outfit he was seen wearing consisted of blue jeans, a blue ski jacket, and white tennis shoes with black stripes. When news of Brad's disappearance reached his first cousin, Tony DiPilato, a police officer in Youngstown, he knew he had to help. He joined the search efforts in Boardman, determined to find his cousin and bring him back home safely. But despite the efforts of the police and the community, it was as if Brad had simply vanished into thin air. His disappearance left a void in the hearts of his family and friends, and a sense of unease settled over the once peaceful town. On the morning of April 4th, 1972, Paul Smith, a sanitation worker, began his routine trash collection. As he approached the dumpster behind Aisley's dairy store, he noticed something strange. The dumpster was partially filled, and a pair of sneakers was sticking up at an odd angle. Upon closer inspection, he was horrified to find the body of a young boy. The boy was covered with cardboard boxes and waste from the store. His head was also in a downward position, and Paul noticed that a belt was tightly fastened around his neck. The scene playing before Paul's eyes was all too much to take in, and he immediately called the police, who arrived on the scene in no time. The officers had a sinking feeling as they peered into the dumpster and laid eyes on the small body lying inside. It looked like the missing boy they had been searching for, but they needed confirmation. They contacted Tony, who had been helping in the search for his cousin, and asked him to help identify the body. Tony rushed to the scene, and with a heavy heart, he confirmed the worst. The body in the dumpster was that of his beloved cousin, Brad. Following this, the body was carefully removed from the dumpster and transported to Southside Hospital in Youngstown for an autopsy. Tony, on the other hand, was tasked with the heart-wrenching responsibility of informing Brad's parents of the devastating news. "It was terrible for my Aunt Elisa and the whole family," Tony said. "You never get past it. You hear about things like this, but you never believe it could happen to you or to your family member." Don was in school when he got the news that his best friend was dead. His teacher had given the announcement about Brad's death. The shock and grief hit him like a ton of bricks, and he could hardly believe what he had just heard. As Brad's loved ones grappled with the shock of his tragic death, the results of the autopsy were released. The coroner's report revealed that Brad had been strangled to death and subjected to a heinous form of physical abuse. It was also estimated that Brad had passed away at 9 p.m. on Saturday, April 1st, over 24 hours after he was last seen alive. The gruesome details of the report only added to the heartache and despair that Brad's family and friends were already feeling. Police wasted no time in launching an investigation to find the person responsible for this horrific crime. As part of the investigation, Don was summoned to the station. They showed him Brad's clothing and asked if they were the same clothes Brad was wearing when he left Don's house. Don confirmed that they were, and when shown the belt found around Brad's neck, he identified it as Brad's own. Don couldn't shake off the thought of the brown van he and Brad had seen on the day of his disappearance. He believed that the suspicious vehicle was connected to his best friend's death. "I think whoever was in that van waited until he was in a dark spot and took him," Don said, as the investigation people from all corners of the town, pupils from his school, parents, and teachers alike all gathered to mourn the loss of the young boy who had been taken far too soon. The whole town seemed to be united in their grief, and the air was heavy with sadness and disbelief. The town was also never the same after Brad's death. Don and his family could no longer bear the weight of the grief and constant reminders of the tragic incident. And so they decided it was time to move on and started afresh in Tennessee, away from the memories that haunted them. In June 1972, 2 months after Brad's funeral, they packed their belongings and left Boardman for good. As days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The investigation into Brad's death seemed to be going nowhere. Despite following up on numerous leads and interrogating several suspects, the detectives assigned to the case kept hitting dead ends. Every step of the way, just nothing. Tony recalls of the investigation into Brad's death. With time, the case grew colder, and the hope of finding justice for Brad faded away. In 2001, Boardman former police chief Jeffrey Patterson refused to let Brad's case go cold. He made a bold move by reopening the investigation. Detectives were sent to the cemetery where Brad was laid to rest, and they exhumed his body to collect DNA evidence. Another of Chief Jeffrey's significant efforts was taking Brad's clothes, which were kept as evidence, and sending them to the state's Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. Upon inspection, forensic scientists found something that left them in shock. They discovered DNA that did not belong to Brad. The finding brought renewed energy to the investigation, and the detectives were determined to leave no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice. However, despite their best efforts, the investigation hit a brick wall for several years. In 2007, the police chief Jeffrey decided to reassign the case to 2 new detectives, Jack Nichols and Bob Rupp. Nichols had grown up in the neighborhood where Brad went missing and had been just 14 years old when the tragic incident had taken place back in 1972. The case had stayed with him all these years, and now he had the opportunity to bring justice to Brad's memory. He vowed to give the case his all. Both Nichols and Rupp dove head first into the investigation as soon as it was assigned to them. Their first task was to sort through the mountains of paperwork and the countless boxes of poorly organized evidence. It was a daunting task, but the two were determined to make the most of it all. As they spent hours looking at the files, they started noticing the names of 7 individuals cropping up repeatedly. These 7 became persons of interest, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't be considered suspects. However, Nichols and Rupp didn't give up. They immediately obtained search warrants and went to work. They served the search warrants and collected DNA samples from each of the persons of interest. The samples were then sent to the lab for testing, and they hoped to find a match with the DNA found on Brad's clothes. However, their hopes were dashed as the lab results came back negative. None of the 7 were a match. With this, the detectives were back to square one, but they refused to give up. They kept on combing through the case files, determined to find any new clues. Unfortunately, their tireless efforts yielded nothing. After years of working on the case, Detectives Nichols and Rupp retired and a new team took over. Leading the team was the highly experienced Boardman Police Captain Albert Kekasik. With a fresh set of eyes and new perspectives, the investigation was about to take a new turn. Boardman police detectives knew that advanced technology was needed to analyze the DNA found on Brad's clothing. And in 2018, they turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology company. Parabon was able to use familial DNA to narrow down the suspects to a group of people with certain physical characteristics or a similar family tree. Over the next 4 years, the detectives worked tirelessly taking DNA samples from people identified by Parabon with possible familial links to the unknown subject. The results of these DNA tests helped them to narrow down their search to specific branches of the extended family tree while also eliminating others. In the end, all their hard work paid off. With the help of DNA tests, they were able to zero in on a man named Joseph Norman Hill. Following this lead, detectives worked tireless to locate a relative of Hill's and collect DNA samples for testing. After testing the relative's DNA, the results showed that there was a 98.2% chance that the DNA found on Brad's clothes belonged to Hill. The detectives had finally cracked the case and found the man responsible, but there was a major setback. Hill, the man identified through DNA testing, was no longer alive. He had passed away in 2019 after a long battle with cancer. And to make matters worse, his body had been cremated. With this, detectives were unable to carry out any further testing on Hill's remains to confirm his guilt. As the detectives delved deeper into Joseph Norman Hill's life, they couldn't help but be surprised. For one, the man had remained under the radar all these years. They also discovered that at the time of the murder, Hill was 32 and living on Shadyside Drive in Boardman. He drove a truck for a bottled water company and relocated to California in 1978 for work. Interestingly, there was no known connection between Hill and Brad's family, leaving detectives scratching their heads. Hill's only brush with the law was a 1986 conviction for disorderly conduct and solicitation for a rude act in Los Angeles. Mahoning County Prosecutor Gina DeGeneva was responsible for reviewing the evidence compiled by the Boardman police in Brad's murder case. She and her team carefully combed through every piece of information and found that if Joseph Norman Hill were still alive, she would have been confident in presenting the evidence to a grand jury. It was a huge step forward in the case, and the detectives could finally rest easy knowing that their hard work had paid off. Boardman Police Chief Todd Worth disclosed on January 24, 2023 during a press conference that Brad's family had opted not to make any public statements and requested that they be left alone to process the new information and continue their healing process. It was a difficult time for them, and the last thing they needed was any further disturbance or media intrusion. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. In 1984, Virginia Hannon was settling into retired life after working for years as a cook and lunch lady at Bryantville Elementary School in Pembroke, Massachusetts. The 59-year-old widow had recently come into some inheritance money and lived alone in her apartment. Then, on February 12, 1984, the unthinkable happened. Someone broke into Virginia's home, where she was beaten, stabbed, and strangled with a pair of her own stockings. The senseless murder shocked her family and stumped police, who interviewed more than 50 people during their investigation. But since they couldn't establish any leads or suspects, the case went unsolved. For years, Virginia's family wondered what led to that night. Some speculated that her recent inheritance was a motivator for the crime, as she'd recently collected $380,000 from an aunt. According to her nephew, Virginia had never flaunted the money, but did tell a few friends about it. Her family tried to keep the story alive and in the public eye. In 2019, they held a vigil on the 35th anniversary of her death. That same year, investigators discovered the DNA samples taken from the crime scene all belonged to the same man. They just didn't know who he was yet. They tried to use forensic genealogy to identify the suspect, but it was unsuccessful. Her killer remained unknown until one day in February 2020, when a man walked into the Pembroke Police Department. The man told police that in 2019, his friend, Jesse Aylward, had confessed to killing a woman in Pembroke years prior. Then, they learned that Aylward had just died the day before. With this tip, the police were able to obtain a search warrant and retrieve a blood sample from Aylward's body at Brockton Hospital. They then compared his DNA to 3 pieces of evidence from the crime scene and confirmed it was a match. Though Virginia's murderer had been identified, her family and the police are still troubled by the lack of motive, which was never established. Police have no reason to believe Virginia and Aylward knew each other, though he lived close to her home at the time of the murder. Aylward had a criminal past, which included some assaultive behavior, but the police did not suspect him during their initial investigation. Her family, though feeling somewhat relieved from the revelation, believes there are more people out there with information. Virginia is remembered by her family as a woman who took care of stray animals, loved bingo, family cookouts, and ice cubes in her beer glass. She was a great woman, said her nephew, Richard Hannon. She was a very family-oriented and loved the area, loved the people around her, and was very generous. On December 11, 2011, a motorist pulled over next to the woods near the University Parkway in Manatee County, Florida, when he came across a body. It was 29-year-old Nicole Rose Scott. She was partially clothed and had visible trauma to her face from an apparent beating. An autopsy later revealed Nicole was strangled to death, and that her body had been left in a heavily wooded area for a few days before it was discovered. For the next 10 years, detectives tried to solve Nicole's murder, but made no arrests. One suspect on their radar, though, was Benjamin Moulton. Nicole was a sex worker, and they suspected Moulton of being one of her customers. They questioned Moulton during their investigation, but he denied being involved in Nicole's murder, and without any evidence to link him to the crime, they let him go. A few days prior to Nicole's murder, a pregnant sex worker accused Moulton of trying to kill her. He was arrested for the crime in February 2012 and was charged with attempted murder, sexual battery, and aggravated battery of a pregnant woman. The charges were later dropped, though it is not clear why. Around the same time in 2012, Moulton had criminal charges pending against him for breaking into a woman's home. The woman woke up at around 3 a.m. to find Moulton standing next to her bed. She jumped out of bed, and Moulton ran out of the home, but was found soon after. The police later determined he'd removed at least one knife from the woman's kitchen drawer. He pleaded no contest to armed trespassing and was sentenced to probation. Then, 10 years later, on September 29, 2021, 43-year-old Moulton walked into the Manatee County Sheriff's Office and confessed to Nicole's murder. When asked why he was admitting to the crime now, he told police he found Jehovah and couldn't live with the guilt anymore. A spokesperson for the Manatee Sheriff's Office said Moulton appeared to have had a major change in his life, that he seemed remorseful and ready to face the consequences of his actions. Moulton was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Nicole Rose Scott. On November 18, 2020, Decatur Police Department Sean McAdam received one of the strangest calls of his 15-year career. "I want to confess to a murder I did years ago," said the man on the other end of the phone. The man was identified as 53-year-old Johnny Dwight Whited. But Detective McAdam was skeptical of Whited's confession, especially because he couldn't pinpoint what year he committed the murder he was confessing to. "Confessions take a lot of time to get to that point," he said. "You don't start with the confession and work backwards." And yet that's exactly what they did. After Wood had provided police with a description of the crime scene, they reviewed every homicide in the city dating back to the 1980s. Then they found a match: the April 1995 murder of Christopher Alvin Daly. Detective McAdam and other officers met with Whited to retrace the steps of the crime. From the back of a patrol car, he guided the officers to a remote gravelly area where he reenacted the murder. It was there that Christopher's body was found with a single gunshot wound to the head. His 1983 Toyota Tercel was found partially submerged in the Tennessee River, approximately 4 miles away from his body. Christopher was last seen attending an employee meeting at the Huntsville Hilton Hotel, where he worked as a server. He was reported missing the next day on April 26, 1995. Just prior to the police receiving the missing person report, 2 17-year-olds discovered Christopher's body. During their initial investigation, detectives came up empty on suspects, witnesses, weapons, and motives. At the time, Decatur Police Sergeant John Bradford called the case a real whodunit. 25 years later, at the scene of the crime, White had provided officers with specific details that legitimized his confession. He was then arrested and charged with the death of Christopher Alvin Daly. Police declined to discuss a potential motive for the murder, but confirmed that Whited and Christopher didn't know each other beforehand. According to Detective McAdams, Whited wanted to get the confession off his chest while he still had time, as he was terminally ill from stage 4 lung cancer. Whited was reportedly remorseful of the crime and apologized multiple times. Detective McAdams credits the original detectives for their work in the case, saying, "They're the ones who did all the hard work. I just closed the last page of the book they wrote." On March 21, 2016, 22-year-old Dantrell Burks was shot and killed while riding his bicycle on the sidewalk in Houston Green's Bayou neighborhood. The murder stunned his family, who described Dantrell as a good kid who always brought people together. At the time, the police didn't have any witnesses to the crime and few leads to go off of. But Chantrell's family determined to find his murderer and wouldn't give up. They followed up on the leads and rumors, and although they never gave up hope, they also never found the closure they were after. His aunt, Angela Burks, described it as feeling like a wild goose chase. She assumed the police would throw Dantrell's case to the side, with the other cold cases never to be solved. But then, in October of 2021, a surprise confession changed everything. Chris Roddy was already in jail for a sexual assault charge when police approached him about a different cold case: the 2017 murder of Kathy Paget, who lived on the same block as Dantrell. 34-year-old Kathy was murdered on April 24, 2017, while home in her apartment with her daughter, who was 2 years old at the time. Her daughter was left unharmed, but Kathy was found dead with severe head trauma. Neighbors say that they saw Kathy and Roddy arguing the day she was murdered. Allegedly, Roddy believed that Kathy was bringing prostitution customers to her apartment, and he didn't approve of it. He reported prayed before killing her, believing God was leading him to kill her on behalf of her child. At the time, police linked Roddy to Kitty's murder after they found a soda can with his DNA on it, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. In 2020, the police were re-examining Kitty's murder and decided to interview Roddy again. During their meeting, Roddy immediately confessed to the murder of Kitty Paget. And then he said, "There's another one. Do you want to hear about that one?" Roddy then told detectives that he was driving along Northborough Drive when he saw Dantrell on his bike. He claims that Dantrell flashed a gang symbol to Roddy when he passed by, and that Roddy believed Dantrell was falsely claiming to be part of a gang, so he shot and killed him. Police had not previously considered Roddy as a suspect in Dantrell's murder. Sergeant Michael Burrow, who was the one interviewing Roddy, said that the confession caught him completely off guard. He also said that Roddy had experienced a religious conversion and wanted to get the confession off of his chest. Brody has also been linked to other crimes, including a robbery, a sexual assault of a female jogger. He's also claimed to have attacked other women in a similar manner. 30-year-old Roddy is currently in jail on 5 charges, including the murder of Dantrell Burks and the murder of Kathy Paget, with his bond set at over $1 million. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Ashley Simpson was born in Calgary but lived and worked all over Canada. She loved the outdoors and enjoyed hiking and gold panning. She was able to explore a large area of the country because she traveled around with her father, John, who worked as a cook at various mines and hunting lodges and was training Ashley in the profession. While Ashley did not necessarily have a passion for being a cook, she loved being able to travel and work with her father. She got along well with her other co-workers and with customers. In February of 2016, Ashley into a trailer on Yankee Flats Road near Salmon Arm, British Columbia, with her boyfriend, Derek. On April 27, 2016, the couple into an argument about finances. Ashley had plans to travel to Ontario to see her family. She was going to attend her sister's baby shower and then go to work with her father for the summer. However, there was no money for her to use to make the trip. After the argument ended, Derek went inside their trailer and went to sleep. When Derek woke up the following morning and Ashley was not there, he was not immediately concerned because he assumed someone had given her a ride into town so she could start making her way to Ontario. However, Ashley never got in contact with her family or arrived home. She was reported missing on April 30th. Authorities had few leads in the early days of the investigation. The first potential piece of physical evidence was not found for 2.5 years. On October 9, 2018, Ashley's Ontario photo identification was found inside a sewage vacuum truck used by the Sasquatch Crossing Lodge in Pink Mountain, British Columbia, while its tank was being cleaned. Pink Mountain is roughly 800 miles north of where Ashley was last seen. The ID was not highly discolored and appeared as though, however it ended up in the tank, it had not been there for very long. However, Ashley had spent 3 seasons working with her father at the Buffalo Inn, the motel associated with the Sasquatch Crossing Lodge. John Simpson believes his daughter had her ID stolen at some point, meaning that the ID that was found could have been the stolen one and ended up in the tanks because the thief lost or discarded it, not because Ashley had been back in the area. What at first seemed like it may be a promise clue ultimately did not move the case forward. Ashley was not the only woman to go missing in that area of British Columbia around that time. Between 2016 and 2017, 4 other women, Caitlin Potts, Tracy Gennaro, Deanna Wirtz, and Nicole Bell all went missing in that area. Tracy Gennaro did not remain missing, however. In November of 2017, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police located her remains during a search of a farm located between Vernon and Salmon Arm, British Columbia. The RCMP searched the property for more than a week after they found Tracy, beating the speculation that they may have been looking for the remains of the other missing women. The farm was owned by the parents of a man named Curtis Sagmohan, who has since been charged and convicted on charges stemming from violent attacks against women. He so far has not been formally linked to the disappearances of any of the women or Tracy General's death. When their daughter first went missing, Cindy and John Simpson considered all of the possibilities. She could have been trafficked or kidnapped and held against her will. However, based on the passage of time and their conversations with the RCMP, they believe that Ashley is most not alive. "I know somebody took her life, and I know that people know about it," Cindy said in 2020. "Somebody knows something. There is more than one person who knows, and they are being quiet. Even if Ashley is deceased, her family wants to bring her home to lay her to rest." John Simpson has made multiple trips to British Columbia to look for her, depleting his life savings in the process. During one of these trips in the spring of 2017, John planned on searching for his daughter's remains along the banks of the Salmon River. Unfortunately, the river had recently flooded, and the area was not safe to search on foot. John then had the idea to use drones in the search. He spoke to some friends he had made in the area who were able to put him in contact with a 14-year-old who had multiple drones. John hired the boy to search the riverbanks from above with his drones, and while Ashley was not found during this first set of drone searches, the experience showed John just how useful drones could be in cases like his daughter's. The Simpson family had already been raising money for women's shelters following Ashley's appearance. They then decided to add another charity event to their roster and raised enough money to buy drones for a volunteer group searching for the 4 missing women near Salmon Arm. He hopes to eventually build up a network of drones and drone operators to assist families with missing loved ones all across Canada. Cindy Simpson still speaks to the RCMP regularly, but so far, there have been no new leads in Ashley's case. "All it takes is somebody to say enough is enough and call the RCMP," Cindy said in 2020. "Just make at least one family's life a little better. It will never be the way it was, but it could be a little better by having Ashley home and resting with her family where she belongs." John Simpson's uncle is offering a $10,000 reward in Ashley's case. Nestled in the rolling hills of West Virginia lies a hidden gem of a town known as Terra Alta. With a population of just over 1,400, this small town has a big heart and plenty of charm. And it is here our next case takes place. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning. Jeremiah Watkins was born on August 22, 1972 in Morgantown, Monongalia County, and his parents, James Edward Watkins and Enid Nicola, were overjoyed to welcome their precious bundle of joy into the world. Sadly, tragedy struck the Watkins family just 4 years later when Jeremiah's father passed away, leaving Enid to raise their son alone. Despite the heartbreak, Enid remained strong and devoted to her little boy, providing him with all the love and care he needed. As the years went by, it's not clear if Enid ever remarried. But around 1985, she was living in Terra Alta with her 2 children, Jeremiah, and a baby girl named Jamie, who was only a few months old at the time. Jeremiah loved his baby sister, and nothing filled his heart with more happiness than doting on her. He would spend hours playing with her and making her laugh. Apart from this, one more thing brought him pure joy, and this was a good old-fashioned Kit Kat chocolate. Whenever he took a bite of that sweet, crunchy goodness, he felt like the happiest boy in the world. And what better way to work off the calories than by exploring every inch of the beautiful town he called home. With his bicycle, Jeremiah rode through the hills and valleys of West Virginia, his adventurous spirit leading him wherever it pleased. For Jeremiah, life was all about the simple pleasures, the love of family and the beauty of nature. However, when they least expected it, things took a dark turn. One day, Jeremiah set out for his usual playtime, but never made it back home. The exact date is unknown, but it was during early November in 1985 as West Virginia was hit by a powerful rainstorm that caused severe flooding. The aftermath was devastating, with roads and bridges left in shambles and authorities struggling to aid those affected. Sadly, the flooding claimed the lives of over 40 people. In the midst of the chaos and destruction, authorities began a search for Jeremiah, but they were hindered by the flood water. And despite their best efforts, Jeremiah remained missing for many agonizing days. The search for Jeremiah came to a heartbreaking end on November 12, 1985, when deputies stumbled upon a shallow hole near the train tracks in Terra Alta, about 30 miles away from Morgantown. As they peered into the hole, their hearts sank as they realized it was the lifeless body of Jeremiah whom they had been searching for. Initially, the officers wondered if the heavy flooding had claimed another victim, but upon closer examination, they discovered a shocking truth. There was a stab wound on the boy's back. It was clear that the little boy had met a violent end. Desperate to find any leads, the officers scoured the surrounding area for any clues, but the heavy rains and flooding had washed away any potential evidence, leaving them with nothing but questions and a heart-wrenching tragedy to unravel. Enid's heart shattered into 1,000,000 pieces when she received the news of Jeremiah's death. She couldn't comprehend how such a senseless and tragic event could have happened to her son. The pain of her loss was immense, and she struggled to cope with the reality of never seeing her child again. The results of the autopsy that was later conducted on Jeremiah's body showed that in addition to the stab wound that ultimately led to his death, he had also suffered a devastating blow to the head which had caused a fatal brain bleed. With this, detectives soon launched into an intensive investigation to bring the culprit to justice. They interviewed countless people and followed every possible lead, but the case remained a mystery. Despite their tireless efforts, the detectives were unable to identify any suspects or make any arrests, leaving the case unsolved for years. As his sister Jamie grew older, she couldn't help but wonder about the brother she had barely known. "I feel like I had a memory or two of him," Jamie said. "But you know, at one, how much do you remember?" When she finally learned the truth about how her brother had died, she was simply devastated. And from then on, she carried the heavy burden of unanswered questions. Who had done this to her brother? Why had they done it? These were the haunting thoughts that consumed her. As Jamie became an adult, the unresolved murder of her brother Jeremiah continued to weigh heavily on her mind. In the early 2000s, while attending college, she decided to take action and reached out to the authorities for information regarding the case. Unfortunately, the response she received was disheartening. The case had long gone cold, and the passage of time had made the likelihood of finding the culprit very slim. In February 2023, an officer of the Preston County Sheriff's Office, Captain T.N. Tignall, decided to take on the decades-old unsolved murder case of Jeremiah. He couldn't bear the thought of the family being deprived of justice for so long, so he dug deep into the old case files, determined to uncover any overlooked clues that could lead to a breakthrough. He spent hours poring over interviews and witness statements until something caught his eye. It was the view of a young man named David Monroe Adams, who was only 18 at the time of the murder and lived in Terra Alta. The captain noticed that Adams' statement had some inconsistencies and decided to find him to interview him again. The inconsistencies he found have remained undisclosed. Captain Tignall's dedication to solving Jeremiah's case led him to track down Adams that same February, and with the assistance of other law enforcement agencies, he conducted several interviews with him. During one of the interviews, Adams confessed to killing Jeremiah, and the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. Adams had apparently gotten into an argument with Jeremiah over a stolen bicycle, and this argument had quickly turned violent. In a fit of rage, Adams hit the boy in the face and then took him to a nearby shed where he fatally stabbed him. Afterwards, he dragged the lifeless body into a shallow hole where it was eventually found. The confession was a victory for the detectives, and they knew that they had finally put an end to the unsolved case that had haunted the community for nearly 4 decades. As soon as Adams confessed to the murder of Jeremiah, he was immediately arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The judge set a bond of $1 million, and he was taken to North Central Regional Jail, where he is currently being held. Following this, a deputy reached out to Enid at her apartment, informing her that her son's killer had been caught. Enid immediately contacted her daughter Jamie to break the news. She was simply overwhelmed with relief and disbelief. While Jamie still has lingering questions about her brother's death, the family remains hopeful about finally receiving justice. 19-year-old Samantha Jean Hopper was last seen on September 11, 1988 in Pope County, Arkansas. That night, the 8-month pregnant expecting mother had plans to meet up with a friend and go to a concert in Little Rock, Arkansas. She had dropped off her oldest daughter, Desiree, at her mother's house beforehand and was on her way to drop off her other daughter, 22-month-old Courtney Holt, with Courtney's father before heading to the concert. It was around mid-afternoon when Samantha said goodbye to her mom and oldest daughter. Samantha drove off in her blue Ford Tempo, and neither she nor Courtney were seen again. She never made it to Courtney's father's house, nor to meet her friend. The car had been new to Samantha. She'd saved up from her job as a server at the breakfast chain Waffle House. The car was so new she had yet to put her proper insurance plates on the vehicle. Samantha and her daughter were both reported missing, but there was no trace of where she or her daughter had went. Courtney's father had initially been a suspect, but he was quickly cleared of any involvement in the disappearances. Despite an extensive investigation, the case went cold. But Desiree Carpenter, Samantha's surviving daughter, never gave up. She spent years searching for her mother and sister before reaching out to the non-profit group Adventures with Purpose, a team of expert divers who travel across the United States to help solve cold cases. Their team has solved nearly 24 cold cases. In October of 2021, the Adventures with Purpose team began their search for Samantha and Courtney. According to lead diver Duck Bishop, the team took the facts they learned from the family and the facts they were able to find online and used that information to narrow the scope of their search area. Then they searched the nearby bodies of water using advanced sonar systems. On October 26th at 12:30 p.m., Pope County 911 operators received a long-awaited call. Within an hour of searching, the Adventures with Purpose team had found a car matching the description of Samantha's blue Ford Tempo in Lake Dardanelle near the 37 block of Pleasant View Road. The car was overturned right below the bridge that crosses Lake Dardanelle. The car was removed from the water, and inside they found human remains, as well as a car seat. Samples were sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab in Little Rock for DNA testing. A spokesperson for the Pope County Sheriff's Department confirmed that Samantha was in the vehicle, though official identification is still pending. At this time, there is no explanation of what may have happened that caused the mother to lose control of the vehicle, though the car will be investigated for any mechanical defects. Police are very confident that the remains will be a match. A memorial fund has been set up by Desiree to raise donations for her mother and sister's burial. On the page, Desiree shared, "After being missing for over 23 years with the assistance of the AWP and Chaos Dive teams, we were able to find my mother, who was 9 months pregnant, and my 22-month-old sister, Courtney. This has been such a relief to have found her, and we want to provide them with the proper burial. If you're ever able to donate or even just pass this along, it would be forever appreciated." As for the Adventures with Purpose team, diver Doug Bishop said that providing the family with answers is all they can hope for. On the night of February 24th, 2006, 24-year-old Crystal Theobalt was driving through her family's neighborhood in Riverside, California with her brother and boyfriend. Her mother, Belinda Lane, was in a car ahead of them. They were stopped at a stop sign when a white Ford Expedition pulled in front of them and shot at the vehicle before fleeing the scene. Crystal's boyfriend was shot in the stomach and Crystal had been shot in the head. She was taken to the hospital where she died from her injuries 2 days later. Her boyfriend survived. Crystal had been a shining, beautiful, caring young woman, Belinda's only daughter and the youngest of her 4 children. Belinda said, "She was just my pride and joy. I wanted a daughter so bad. I had 3 sons, and so the 4th one I was like, yay, I got my little girl." Crystal was strong, independent, overcoming domestic violence and getting her children out of bad home situation. Her death had been so traumatic and no one could believe that she was gone. Crystal's mother, Belinda, was determined to find out who killed her daughter and why, and with few leads from the police, she decided to take it upon herself. "I told her, baby girl, I promise you, if it takes my last breath, I will get them. I promise you, you will have justice," she said. The police investigation was slow. The lead detective had only covered one other homicide investigation, which still remains unsolved. The main evidence from the case were the eyewitnesses, a shoe left behind, and gun casings collected at the crime scene. A canvassing of the neighborhood had yielded few results. With gang violence prevalent in their community, few were willing to step forward. Law enforcement went very aggressively at Belinda and her family. Allegedly, officers arrested one of Belinda's older sons and interrogated him for hours, accusing him of being responsible for the attack from the rival gang that had killed his sister. After that, a line had been drawn in the sand. Belinda and her family refused to cooperate with the detectives. She didn't trust them. She had decided to take matters into her own hands. Belinda knew that if she could figure out who owned the white Ford Expedition, she could find her daughter's killers. She had seen his face very clearly. She described him as very young, with a baby face, and she knew she would be able to identify him if she found him. Crystal's younger brother Nick had heard that members of the local 5,150 gang were responsible for Crystal's murder, even though she had no connection to them. The neighborhood had been a rival territory for several gangs operating in the area. It had been prone to violence since 2003, when the newer 5,150 gang had been trying to establish turf in the area. The gang had a quick evolution from minor infractions and escalated very quickly to murder. They were known for their propensity for extreme violence, and they were the most feared gang in the area. Nick, only 13, also had heard that they were easy to find on MySpace. He told this to his cousin Jamie, who was 14 years old, who volunteered to help Belinda find the gang members that had killed Crystal. Nick and Jamie were very young and both said they didn't really understand what gangs were or what kind of people had killed Crystal. They just wanted to help get justice for her murder. MySpace had been the social media platform to be on for young people in the early 2000s. Everyone was on it, and like the Instagrams and Facebooks of today, they had messaging features in addition to the blogging features that were a key part of MySpace's success. Belinda agreed, and Jamie started by creating a profile for Rebecca using a photo of a random woman from the internet and filled her bio with information that she felt would attract the gang members. She befriended as many of them as she could and started messaging them, successfully gaining personal information. But Belinda didn't think it was enough, so they made a second profile under the name Angel and used pictures of Crystal in an attempt to make them fall in love with her. Catfishing, as it's known today, the bio read, "I'll be your biggest life mistake and your deepest, darkest, best kept secret." On Angel's profile, the friends' requests and messages started pouring in. In April of 2006, they started messaging with 17-year-old William Joke Sotelo, a member of the 5,150 gang. Through these messages, they found out that Sotelo was the owner of the White Ford Expedition. Their catfishing had been completely successful. Belinda took the information to the police, who then brought Sotelo in for questioning, where he cooperated and identified Crystal's shooter as 18-year-old Julio Leal Juero Heredia. According to Riverside homicide detective Rick Wheeler, the 1.50 members had been driving around the neighborhood that night looking for a rival gang that had shot at them earlier. When Belinda and Crystal stopped, the gang thought they were coming to attack them, so they started shooting. Since there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Sotelo at the time he was released, Jamie continued to message him on MySpace and he started to fall for Angel, but pretending to be her dead cousin and making men fall in love with her became too much to bear and she wanted out. But Belinda wasn't so sure. She was frustrated that Sotelo hadn't been arrested yet and wanted to keep going. She decided she wanted to kill the gang members herself. She took over the profile and even made a plan to murder them until her family convinced her to back off. Instead, Belinda blew her online cover and confronted Sotelo. She knew that he'd fallen for Angel and she wanted him to hurt as much as she did. So she sent him a final message that read, "If you claim you care about me so much, then why did you kill me?" He never responded and then he disappeared completely. Belinda gave up and handed over the profile to the investigators. In 2007, the shooter Harilla was charged with Crystal's murder, and in 2011, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 10 other gang members involved were charged with additional counts, including witness intimidation, attempted murder, and gun and gang charges, leading to sentences that ranged from probation to 18 years in prison. But Salido was still nowhere to be found. Then, in 2014, Belinda received a tip through Facebook. Salido was working as a chili farmer in Mexico and had a wife and 4 children. She sent the tip to the police, and on May 6, 2016, Sotelo was arrested and brought back to California to face his charges. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He was the last person to be arrested and sentenced for Crystal's murder. Riverside Police Lieutenant Christian Dinko said that Belinda was instrumental in identifying Sotelo. He said, "She provided important information that helped lead us the capture of William Sotelo. Without her help, he would likely still be outstanding right now." The story was made into a Netflix true crime documentary called Why Did You Kill Me?, which premiered in 2021. Director and producer Frederick Munch said, "We knew that we had an incredible hook, which is kind of the MySpace catfishing angle. But kind of equally important was also this idea that it might be a story that begins in some ways as conventional true crime story, and that hopefully ultimately asks broader questions about the criminal justice system, about empathy, about how one deals with grief, and also how this single event might reverberate throughout an entire community." Belinda said that she can finally forgive the people responsible for killing her daughter now that they've been brought to justice. Today, she runs a Facebook group in memory of her daughter called Unsolved Murders in Riverside, where she shares information in hopes of solving other cold cases in the area. Aaron Foster and Jeremy Beckle disappeared on April 3, 2000 in Sparta, Tennessee. That night, Aaron, 18, and Jeremy, 17, picked up Aaron's brother from an arcade in Aaron's 1988 Pontiac Grand Am and drove him home before heading out to a party in a rural part of town. Around 9 p.m., Jeremy called his dad, Ronnie Beckle, to arrange a ride for the next day. But when Ronnie showed up, Jeremy was nowhere to be found. Both of their parents became suspicious when neither Aaron nor Jeremy returned home, but they thought they'd give him a few days. When days passed without any sign of either teenager, Aaron's family reported them missing. Rumors started running rampant in their small town. People crafted wild theories about where the missing teens had gone. Some said they ran away, while others speculated murder or a drug operation gone wrong. These rumors were just that, rumors. Still, they gained the attention of the local police, who spent time investigating leads that went nowhere, derailing the investigation and frustrating the victim's family and friends. Sheriff Steve Page of White County and the victim's family both agreed that law enforcement at the time didn't handle the case well. They never searched Aaron or Jeremy's rooms for clues or evidence, nor did they question their friends from the party. Then, more than 20 years later, Jeremy's side stepped in. Jeremy runs a YouTube channel called Exploring with Nug, where he documents his river treasure hunting adventures. He started playing around with metal detector scuba dive and started searching for cars, then missing people scuba dive and started searching for cars, then missing people in the water. He found his targets by scouring the Charlie Project website, which is a database of missing persons cases. He'd look for unusual cases involving people that had seemingly vanished in thin air, just like Aaron and Jeremy did. In late 2021, he came across their case and headed over to Sparta to start his search. In November, he posted a video of his first search in the area, where he found a car, but it wasn't Aaron's Pontiac. The video was then seen by the sheriff, who noticed Jeremy was using side-scan sonar to search the water, technology that wasn't available to their police department. He reached out to Jeremy to join forces and suggested searching the Kafkala River, which runs along Highway 84. A police report that had been misfiled but recently found suggested Aaron and Jeremy may have driven down that road on the night they went missing. And so Jeremy went out on his boat and scanned the river, where he spotted another car. In the chilling footage captured by Jeremy, you can see the car come into view as he dives deeper into the murky waters. He swims to the back of the car, cleaning off the make and model to reveal it's a Pontiac. He then wipes off the license plate to confirm his suspicion. It is indeed Aaron Foster's car. After notifying the sheriff's office of his discovery, the car was extracted from the water and human remains were found inside. Though the remains have not yet been positively identified, Sheriff Page believes they belong to Aaron and Jeremy. Investigators suspect the teenagers lost control of the car and went into the water, as there was no guardrail along the road in 2000. Finding the answers to this decades-long mystery brought about mixed feelings for the victims' families. "It's like losing him all over again," said Jeremy's father. "It just shattered my heart again. We always kind of thought through the years that something happened, but I just didn't know what." GoFundMe pages have been set up in Jeremy Beckle's and Aaron Foster's names to help cover funeral costs. Back in 2011, Hyannis, a charming seaside town in Massachusetts, was buzzing with the infectious energy of a 31-year-old man named Todd Lampley. Todd was known for his beaming smile that could lift anyone's spirits. Everyone who crossed paths with him couldn't resist his warm and welcoming nature. He was the kind of person who would invite you to hang out with him without a second thought. Although Todd was not born and raised in Hyannis, he had quickly made the town his new home. Born in 1980 and originally from Mississippi, Todd had left his hometown around 2002 in search of new opportunities and a fresh start. Upon arriving in Hyannis, he quickly made a name for himself with his easygoing nature and passion for barbecues. Todd's life was full of love, but also full of surprises. He had fathered 3 beautiful little girls, each born to a different mother. While their names were not known to many, there was no doubt that they were the lights of Todd's life. Despite the challenges of co-parenting with multiple women, Todd remained devoted to his daughters. He worked tirelessly to provide for them, and every spare moment was spent showering them with love and attention. Todd also had his fair share of tough times. He found himself on the wrong side of the law more than once and had struggled to keep his head above water at times. But Todd was a fighter, and he refused to let his past define him. Every time he stumbled, he picked himself up and dusted himself off, ready to face whatever came his way. He was determined to make a better life for himself and those he loved, and nothing was going to stand in his way. However, little did he know that things would soon take a dark turn. The night of February 27, 2011 was just like any other for Todd. He was at his home on Fresh Holes Road in Hyannis and was enjoying what was a peaceful evening. His girlfriend Tisha Warrens, who was the mother of one of his daughters, and her mother, Deborah Cook Warren, were also staying with him. However, their daughter was not at home that night. At around 8 p.m., a man named Curtis Collins arrived at the couple's home. He was a good friend of Todd. After exchanging a warm greeting, Curtis was offered a seat at the dinner table, where they all enjoyed a mouth-watering meal of chicken and pasta. As the night wore on, the two men moved to the bedroom, where they settled in to watch a thrilling basketball game on television. In the middle of the game, Curtis suddenly stood up and made his way to the living room to speak to Taisha, leaving Todd alone in the bedroom. Moments later, loud bangs shattered the peace of the evening, and it was followed by Todd's agonizing cries. Taisha's heart pounded as she immediately rushed to the source of the noise, her mind racing with confusion. "It all happened so quick. I didn't even hear the gunshots," said Taisha. Upon getting to the bedroom, she was greeted by a sight that would haunt her for life. Todd was standing, and he told her that he had been shot. With a surge of fear, she rushed to him and tried to support him as they fell on top of her. In the chaos, Todd lost consciousness and his body went limp. Curtis soon appeared in the doorway and quickly dialed 911, his hands shaking as he spoke to the operator. At precisely 1000, the first patrol car screeched to a halt outside the house. Patrolman Peter Meerbeck was the first to enter, his heart pounding as he prepared for the worst. As he stepped inside, he quickly made his way towards the bedroom. There he found Curtis, Tyasia, and her mother huddled around Todd, who lay motionless on the ground and was bleeding. At 10:21 p.m., paramedics arrived at the scene only to find that Todd had already passed away. Despite their best efforts, there was nothing they could do to bring him back. The news was a devastating blow to his loved ones, leaving them reeling with grief and disbelief. Following this, Todd's body was then taken away for autopsy. As detectives arrived at the scene, they carefully examined every inch of the house. They scoured for clues that could reveal the perpetrator of this heinous crime. Just outside the front bedroom window, they stumbled upon 3.22 caliber federal ammunition shell casings. The discovery made it clear to the detectives that the killer had stood outside the window and fired the shots. Apart from the shell casings, the detectives' eyes also landed on a peculiar object lying on the ground beneath the window. It was a sweet potato with a flat cut on one end in a small hollow running along its length. The other end of the potato was shattered, leaving chunks scattered on the windowsill and ground below. Detectives speculated that the potato had been used as a makeshift silencer to muffle the sound of gunshots. Detectives also came across a black Boost mobile cell phone lying in the grass near the corner of the house. Upon examining it, they found that the phone belonged to Curtis. He claimed to have been in possession of 2 phones, but had lost that particular one during the chaos that followed the gunshots. On the February 28, 2011, a day after the tragic incident, the autopsy report was finally released. It revealed that Todd had suffered from 3 gunshot wounds. The wounds had caused fractures in his ribs and injuries in his lungs, ultimately leading to his death. The news only fueled detectives' determination to bring justice to Todd and his family. Detectives Jason Labor and Thomas Chevalier called in Curtis for questioning on the same day and grilled him about what he knew. Curtis recounted the events leading up to the shooting, and he also revealed that he had been using his blue Sanyo phone just a few minutes before the shooting occurred. Following this revelation, the detectives decided to take a closer look at his phones. Curtis was presented with a consent form to authorize the search of his phones, including the black Boost mobile phone found at the scene of the crime. Once the consent form was signed, they wasted no time in obtaining call records for both phones from telecommunication companies. Upon scrutinizing the call records for the black Boost phone, they noticed that the last outgoing call was made at 8:44 p.m. on the day of the incident. When Curtis was asked about the call, he revealed that it was to his girlfriend, Faith Thomas. Detectives then turned their attention to his other phone, which was a blue Sanyo. When they looked at the call records obtained from the telecommunication company and the visual call history on the phone, they realized that something didn't match up. The call record showed that Curtis had made and received calls from a particular number a few minutes before the shooting and also after the shooting. However, these series of calls were strangely absent from the phone's call log. The detectives were stumped by the discrepancy, and their instincts told them that Curtis was hiding something. They believed that he had manually deleted the calls to conceal evidence on the physical phone. By digging deeper, the detectives found that the number Curtis had been communicating with before and after the shooting belonged to a man named Devarius Hampton. The detectives were not about to let Hampton slip through their fingers. It wasn't the first time he had been in trouble with the law. In fact, at the time of the shooting, Hampton was on probation for a previous crime and was being closely monitored with a GPS tracking bracelet. The detectives decided to take a closer look at the data recorded by the tracking device, and what they found was startling. The GPS data showed that Hampton had been in the vicinity of Todd's home at the exact time of the shooting. On March 2, 2011, Devarius Hampton was arrested for an unrelated matter. Detectives Thomas and Jason saw an opportunity to question him about Todd's murder. They hoped that they could get some answers out of him, but things didn't go as planned. Hampton was uncooperative and refused to speak about the matter, leaving the detectives with more questions than answers. On March 18, 2011, 2 workers from Sullivan Engineering, John O'Day and Peter O'Sullivan, were conducting surveys and samples at the mill pond in the Marston Mills section of Barnstable when they stumbled upon a firearm in the murky waters. The workers, alarmed by their discovery, quickly contacted the police and handed over the firearm. Upon examining the weapon, the the detectives were stunned to find that it contained live rounds of the same caliber as the spent shell casing found at the scene of Todd's shooting. This discovery led them to believe that the weapon was indeed the murder weapon. Despite the series of promising leads, the investigation into Todd's murder seemed to somewhat lose steam. However, detectives remained vigilant and kept a close eye on Devereux Hampton. It was clear to them that he was somehow involved in the crime. In late 2012, detectives decided to conduct a DNA analysis on the potato that was found at the crime scene. Shockingly, the results revealed a mixture of 2 human DNA samples with a high probability that one of these samples belonged to a man. After this discovery, things went silent again, but detectives never gave up on finding evidence to solve Todd's murder. They also tried to get their hands on Hampton's DNA for years, but their efforts were in vain. Then, on a fateful day in October 2016, luck finally smiled upon them. Hampton was seen leaving a nursing and rehabilitation center in Centerville, Massachusetts. As he walked away, he carelessly spat phlegm into a small puddle. The detectives who had been watching him quickly sprang into action and collected the phlegm with a Q-tip and cotton ball. These were then carefully placed in an evidence bag and taken back to the lab for analysis. In January 2018, detectives received a break in the form of new data from Hampton's GPS tracking bracelet. The information showed that on the night of February 28, 2011, just a day after Todd's murder, Hampton had made a stop at the mill pond in Marston Mills. The location he had stopped was just 23 feet away from where the firearm believed to have been used in Todd's shooting was discovered. It was a chilling revelation, and the detectives knew that they were getting closer to cracking the case. Things got even more interesting because that same year the results from the analysis conducted on Hampton's phlegm came back. And it showed that there was a high probability that the DNA on the potato found at the crime scene matched Hampton's. Despite this compelling evidence against Hampton surfaced, authorities didn't rush to make an arrest. Perhaps they wanted to make sure their case against him was rock solid before taking action. Finally, on February 24, 2023, Hampton, at the age of 40, was taken into custody and charged with 1 count each of murder and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon in connection with Todd's death. On February 27, 2023, he appeared in court. That particular date marked the 12th anniversary of Todd's death. All eyes were on Hampton as he stood before the judge pleading not guilty to the charges of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. The judge, taking into consideration the severity of the case, ordered him to be held without bail until his probable cause hearing, which is scheduled for April 5, 2023. The news of another arrest in Todd's murder case sent shockwaves through the community on March 7, 2023. Curtis was considered a potential accomplice and was also taken into custody. He was charged with 1 count of murder, and when he appeared in court the next day, he also pleaded not guilty. At the moment, the prosecution still has a long road ahead of them to ensure justice is served for Todd. 21-year-old Roy Gregory Brooks Jr., who went by Greg, lived with his family in Castleberry, Florida. The family attended New Covenant Baptist Church of Orlando, and Greg sang in the church choir. He had attended Lyman High School, where he played drums in the school band. After graduation, he enrolled at Florida A&M University. While he was home from school, he worked at the Regal Cinema in Winter Park. On January 18, 2000, Roy left home to go pick up his paycheck from the cinema. He then planned to go to the Winn-Dixie grocery store in Castleberry to cash it. Around 3 a.m. on January 19th, Greg's mother, Geraldine, abruptly woke up feeling that something terrible had happened. Greg was not home. While he would sometimes stay out late with his friends, being out this late was unusual. An hour and a half later, Greg's black 1992 Honda Accord was found parked near an exit ramp for Interstate 75 in Sun City, Hillsborough County, in an area that at the time had not yet been developed. A trooper from the Florida Highway Patrol saw the car and tagged it as a disabled vehicle. It would later be found that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the car and it was fully operational. When Greg was still not home later in the morning, Geraldine Brooks called police to report him missing. The Brooks family did not learn that Greg's car had been found until 2 days later. The car is the main piece of evidence in Greg's case, but also a source of great confusion. The vehicle was taken in to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office for processing on January 27th, but Greg's father had been allowed to drive it back to Castleberry before it was taken in. The fingerprint report from the car stated that the only fingerprints found inside the car were Greg's. The Brooks family, of course, expected Greg's father's fingerprints to be in the car as he was the last person to drive it. Furthermore, Greg would routinely give rides to all of his friends, but somehow none of their prints were found either. Geraldine Brooks became frustrated with the way her son's case was handled from the very beginning. Police told her that her son had simply run away, and she has argued that this belief prevented them from investigating Greg's case properly. She argues that Greg had no need to run away because as 21-year-old man, he could have packed up and left home at any time he wanted. Furthermore, he did not have any of his clothes, belongings, or medication with him when he disappeared. He also loved his car too much to simply abandon it along the side of the road. Authorities also failed to go to the Winn-Dixie where Greg cashed his check the night he went missing, early enough in the investigation. A receipt found in his car showed that Greg had made it to the store and cashed his $200 paycheck at 6 p.m. By the time police did go to the store several weeks later, the surveillance footage from that evening had already been taped over. The investigator assigned to the case, Castleberry Police Department Detective Thomas Graffey, believes that the original detectives did what they could with limited amount of information available. It seemed like they followed whatever breadcrumbs they had at the time, he told the Orlando Sentinel in 2020. No one had cell phones or social media, so it was a little bit harder to track people back then. They just needed to do what they could. Greg's family has been actively looking for him on their own since he disappeared. Geraldine tried unsuccessfully to get her son's case covered by the local media in hopes of finding witnesses. The family distributed flyers, hired a private investigator, and followed up on potential sightings of Greg in 3 states. Geraldine keeps a spiral notebook full of her notes and developments in the case, including the names of all the numerous detectives assigned to the case over the years. She still keeps Greg's Honda Accord parked in her driveway 20 years after he went missing. Originally, she wanted to hold on to the car in case it could provide further clues in Greg's case, but now it mainly just serves as a reminder of him. Greg went missing the day before his younger brother Jermaine's 16th birthday. Jermaine looked up to his older brother, and his appearance affected him greatly. Jermaine had been an excellent student, but his grades plummeted after Greg went missing. Today, he has a 4-year-old son who has never gotten to meet his uncle Greg. Geraldine loves being a grandmother, but it has not erased the pain of not knowing what happened to Greg. I have to enjoy what I can, but I still grieve for my son every single day, she said in 2020. In the 1950s, people were calling it the murder trial of the century. A general practitioner in Eastbourne, England had been accused of targeting his elderly female patients, worming his way into their wheels, and killing them with a lethal dose of morphine and heroin. Others said he was conducting mercy killings when assisted suicides weren't an option yet, and only painkillers existed. So what was the truth? On January 21, 1899, Adams was born in Rendleston, Ireland, to a religious Protestant family. In 1906, he married Ellen Bodkin, and they went on to have their 2 children, one of whom died during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Adams graduated from the Queen's University in Belfast in 1921. That same year, a surgeon hired him as an assistant houseman at the Bristol Royal Infirmary, where he worked for a year before moving to Eastbourne, England, to work as a general practitioner. There, he would buy a roommate house with money he borrowed from one of his patients, William Mahood. William's wife described Adams as a real scrounger, as he would often invite himself and his family over for dinner, charge his shopping to their accounts, and after William's death, visit the widow only once to take a 22-karat gold pen that belonged to William. As the years went on, more suspicious circumstances arose. In 1935, he received an inheritance of £7,385 from his client, Matilda Whitten, which was more than half of her entire estate. The inheritance was contested by Matilda's family, but upheld in court. After that, Adams started receiving anonymous letters accusing him of bumping off his clients. A few years later, his patient, Agnes Pike, was experiencing deteriorating health. She could not recall her own name or where she was. Bodkin had been administering a cocktail drugs into her system, including morphine, for quite some time. Her family, worried, brought in another doctor who told him there was no medical reason for the injections, so her family halted them. In just a few weeks, she made almost a full recovery. In 1941, Adams earned his diploma in anesthetics and began working at a local hospital. His colleagues didn't remember him fondly. They say he fell asleep during operations, was constantly counting money, and mixed up gas tubes on patients. In 1948, a woman named Edith Morrell suffered a stroke and became partially paralyzed. She then became a patient of Adams, who prescribed her a mixture of heroin and morphine for her discomfort and symptoms. During her time as patient, she made several different wills. In some, Adams was to receive money in furniture. In others, he wasn't mentioned at all. 3 months before her death, she added a clause that Adams wasn't to receive anything from her state. But when she died in 1950, Adams still received a sum of money, cutlery, and her Rolls-Royce. 7 years later, Adams' patient, 50-year-old Gertrude Hullett, died. She had fallen ill, depressed from her father's death a few months prior, and then fell into a coma after a suspected overdose. Even though she was dead, Adams brought in a local pathologist, Francis Camps, to conduct an autopsy. When the pathologist realized that Gertrude was still alive, he accused Adams of extreme incompetence. When Gertrude passed away, Adams recorded the cause of death to be a brain hemorrhage, but an official investigation deemed it to be suicide. And then the pathologist that Gertrude had been poisoned by sleeping pills. Either way, Gertrude's will left valuable items to Adams, including another Rolls-Royce. Adams' inheritance was added into Gertrude's will 5 days before she died. Adams started to gain a reputation as an angel of death or an angel of mercy, depending on who you asked. The rumors that he would target wealthy widows, persuade them to change their wills in his favor, and then inject them with a lethal injection were so rampant that they led to a police investigation. Investigators looked into cases from 1946 to 1956 and found a 163 out of 310 death certificates worthy of investigation. 42% of his patients died from cerebral thrombosis or cerebral hemorrhage, though at the time, the average was around 15%. 163 of the death certificates also stated the person died in a coma. In November of 1956, Adams was arrested and charged for including false representation on cremation certificates and granted bail. He was then arrested again in December and charged with the murder of Edith Morrell. In March of 1957, his trial began. He was first tried for Edith Morrell's murder and then Gertrude Hullett's death. Adams said that Edith was in pain and wanted to die, and that wasn't a crime to ease the suffering of a terminally ill person. Most of the testimonies were made by nurses who cared for Edith around the clock. They testified that Adams would inject Edith with excessive painkillers, including morphine and heroin, but then a judge cross-examined one of the nurses, and it was discovered that Edith's doses were meticulously recorded in a notebook along with the stages of her illness. The notebook was not found during the police investigation, but instead secured by Adams' defense team and revealed inconsistencies in the nurses' testimonies. In April of 1957, the jury found Adams not guilty after just 45 minutes of deliberation. Police still suspected Adams to be guilty despite the acquittal and that he not only killed Gertrude and Edith, but also many other patients. Adams resigned from the National Health Service after the trial. That same year, he was convicted for forging medical prescriptions and fined £2,200. He was taken off the medical register in 1957, but was reinstated as a general practitioner in 1961. On July 4, 1983, Adams died in Eastbourne, England at 84 years old. At the time of his death, he had amassed a fortune of £400,970. It's rumored that Adams was included in at least 132 of his patients' wills. In 2013, Simon Bramwell was a respected consultant surgeon specializing in liver transplant surgery at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, England. That is until another surgeon discovered a strange habit of his. In February-August of 2013, Bramwell had conducted liver transplant surgeries on two patients known as Patient A and Patient B. For Patient A, it was a life-saving surgery. But a week later, their liver failed, and they had to go back under the knife, this time with a different surgeon. During this procedure, the surgeon saw something unusual. Bramwell had branded the patient's liver with his initials, SB. The surgeon photographed the liver and immediately reported it to the medical director. Bramwell had used an argon beam coagulator to brand the 4-centimeter high mark on the liver. An argon beam coagulator is a medical instrument used to cauterize a wound, which helps stop it from bleeding or becoming infected. At the end of 2013, a second incident was reported to the University Hospital Birmingham, NHS Foundation Trust, and Bramwell was suspended from practice. The trust then investigated the incidents. During the investigation, Bramwell said he couldn't remember any other times he branded his patients, other than 2 cases they found. At a disciplinary hearing in May of 2014, the trust found Bramwell guilty of gross misconduct. The West Midlands Police then informed the trust that they were launching a criminal investigation following a complaint from one of Bramwell's victims. That same year, Bramwell resigned from his position. In February of 2017, the General Medical Council issued a warning to Bramwell for his misconduct allegation. According to the case examiners, the warning was issued because his actions didn't contribute to the failure of the first liver transplant. The patients were not put at risk or harmed clinically. There was little or no risk of repetition, and they consider the case exclusively concerning matters of public confidence in their profession. Later that month, he was criminally charged with 2 counts of assault causing bodily harm. On December 23, 2017, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of assault by beating. Though he didn't physically beat his patients, the case was without legal precedent in criminal law, so the charge was chosen as reflection of his actions. The ruling judge said, so far as culpability is concerned, this was conduct born of professional arrogance of such magnitude that it strayed into criminal behavior. What you did was an abuse of power and a betrayal of the trust that these patients had invested in you. During the trial, his defense stated that his actions were done in a naive and foolhardy attempt to relieve tension in the operating room. When a nurse present at the operation questioned why he was branding the liver, he allegedly replied, "I do this." Prosecutors stated that one of Ramos' patients felt violated and suffered PTSD-like symptoms after the incident was brought to light. One of his patients shared an impact statement that said, "The horror of seeing the photo of my cut open body with the initials SB on the liver will forever live in my mind. I personally hate the thought of tattoos anyway, and the thought of someone doing this to me while I was unconscious is abhorrent." In January 2018, Bramwell was sentenced to a 12-month community order and fined £10,000. In December of 2020, the Medical Practitioners Tribunal suspended Bramwell's medical resignation for 5 months, stating that his fitness practice had been impaired. The decision was then appealed by the General Medical Council as they believed the suspension wasn't enough to protect and maintain the public confidence in the profession. High Court Judge, Mrs. Justice Collins Rice, ruled that the Medical Practitioners Tribunal did not put its finger on precisely what was and what was not wrong with Mr. Bramwell's conduct and sanctioned accordingly. The tribunal must now reconsider the case in a fresh hearing. Dying is not a crime. Those were the famous words of Jack Kevorkian, an American pathologist and euthanasia proponent who advocated for terminally ill patients' right to die by physician-assisted suicide. Born on May 26, 1928 in Pontiac, Michigan, Mira Jacob Jack Kevorkian was a child prodigy who taught himself multiple languages. He graduated from Pontiac Central High School with honors in 1945 and graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1952. During his career, he put forth many controversial ideas related to death. He proposed that a death row prisoner should have the opportunity to consent to undergo medical experiments as a form of execution. He also proposed that prisons harvest organs from executed prisoners and use them for sick patients, but prison officials didn't agree. When Kevorkian was a pathologist at Pontiac General Hospital, he experimented by taking blood from corpses that were recently brought into the hospital and transferred them into the living. He approached the U.S. military with his experiment as he thought that they could use it to help wounded soldiers in the war, but they didn't take him up on it. In 1987, Kevorkian started advertising for his death consulting services in Detroit newspaper stating, "Doctor consultant for the terminally ill who wish to die with dignity." His goal was to give those who were terminally ill the opportunity to end their own lives, which was not a readily available or legal option at the time. Kevorkian would attach his patients to one of his machines, the Thantron, which means death machine. It would release a cocktail of drugs or chemicals into the patient through and for. When he lost his license to practice medicine, he lost access to the controlled substance he used. So he created the Mercitron, aka Mercy machine, which was a gas mask connected to a canister of carbon monoxide. In both cases, the patient themselves would release the drug cocktail or gas to end their own life. In 1990, his first public assisted suicide took place in Michigan. His patient was a 54-year-old woman named Janet Atkins, who had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Kevorkian was charged with Janet's murder, but the charges were dropped soon after as Michigan didn't have any laws in place at the time related to assisted suicide. Instead, Michigan State Board of Medicine revoked his medical license. One of Kevorkian's most controversial cases involved a 70-year-old man named Hugh Gale. In 1993, he helped Hugh complete an assisted suicide with his Mercitron machine, after which, documents were found in the garage that noted Hugh requested the gas mask be removed twice, and that Kevorkian only removed it once. The second time, the mask was not removed, and Hugh became unconscious before dying. Michigan legislator then passed a bill making it a felony to knowingly provide anyone with the means to complete suicide to physically assist them in the act. They did not charge Kevorkian with Hugh's death due to the lack of corroboration from witnesses present at the time. In November-December of 1993, Kevorkian was jailed twice for violating the state's law against assisted suicide. And between 1994 and 1997, he was tried 4 times for his roles in assisted suicides, but was acquitted 3 times with the 4th resulting in a mistrial. The trials only helped him gain public support for his cause, and the media dubbed him Dr. Death. But he was often criticized by his fellow practitioners as they believed he was going against their Hippocratic oath to do no harm. According to his lawyer, Kevorkian assisted 130 patients in physician-assisted death. Though Kevorkian's goal was to relieve the pain of terminally ill patients, it was later determined that 60% of his clients were not terminally ill, and 13 had not complained of being in pain. At least 3 autopsies showed his patients had no terminal illness or signs of disease. It is suspected that many of his patients suffered from hypochondria or depression. 5 had no diseases, over a third were in pain, and though many had worsening symptoms, they were not terminally ill. There were also criticisms around how quickly his patients died, as at least 19 patients died just 24 hours after meeting him. Many never had a psychiatric evaluation completed before the assisted suicide, although he himself stated the importance of psychiatric consultations. He also failed to refer 17 patients to specialists after they complained about chronic pain, and he often didn't receive complete medical records from his patients. Kevorkian later stated that he believed patients seeking assisted suicide shouldn't have to be terminally ill to end their suffering. In November of 1998, he allowed CBS 60 Minutes to air a videotape he made in September. The video showed the voluntary euthanasia of his patient, Thomas Yoke, who had Lou Gehrig's disease, also known as ALS. In the videotape, Thomas gives Kevorkian his consent, and Kevorkian gives him a lethal injection. This differed from his previous treatments where the patient administered the lethal dosage themselves. Kevorkian later said that he shared the video because he hoped to take the case to the Supreme Court, which didn't happen. Instead, he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and delivery of controlled substance. Kevorkian dismissed his attorneys and represented himself in his trial. In March of 1999, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison in Coldwater, Michigan. While in prison, he was repeatedly denied parole. In May of 2006, he was reportedly terminally ill with hepatitis C, which he contracted in the 1960s while researching blood transfusions. Doctors didn't expect him to live another year. On June 1, 2007, he was released on parole for good behavior under the condition that he didn't offer advice on, be present at, or participate in any assisted suicides. He was also banned from promoting and talking about them. After his release from prison, he went on to give many lectures on euthanasia, politics, and more, In 2010, a movie based on his life called You Don't Know Jack was released where Al Pacino plays Kevorkian. Outside of his doctoral work, Kevorkian was also a jazz musician and composer. He released a limited CD release called The Kevorkian Suite, A Very Still Life, which featured him playing the organ and flute alongside a quintet. It received praise from the Entertainment Weekly and JazzReview.com. He was also an oil painter who focused on surreal and grotesque themes rife with symbolism. One piece, titled For He Is Risen, was used as cover art for the 1996 Acid Bath album. In a 2010 interview, Kevorkian was asked about his first patient, Janet Atkins, and what it was like to end her life. He said, "I didn't do it to end the life. I did it to end the suffering the patient's going through. What's a doctor supposed to do? Turn his back?" Kevorkian dealt with kidney issues for most of his life and was eventually diagnosed with liver cancer, which his close friend said may have been from hepatitis C. In May of 2011, he was hospitalized, and on June 3, 2011, he died from thrombosis. His tombstone reads, "He sacrificed himself for everyone's rights." Lolita is a town nestled in the heart of Northern California's Humboldt County. With a population of just over 800, Lolita is surrounded by beautiful forests and rolling hills, providing a picturesque backdrop for outdoor activities such as hiking, fishing, and camping. It was in this tranquil paradise that a gruesome discovery was made in 1998. On March 27, 1998, a Lolita resident and his father embarked on a boat ride along the Eel River in search of driftwood. As they navigated through the twists and turns of the river, something odd caught their eye. At first, they thought was just another piece of wood tangled in the branches of a nearby tree. But as they drew closer, they noticed that what they were seeing looked like human body remains. They quickly alerted the authorities, wondering what sinister secrets the river might be hiding. This fateful day would soon become etched into Lolita's history, leaving its inhabitants in shock and disbelief. The sheriff's deputies didn't waste any time. They raced to the Eel River via jet boat, not knowing what horrors awaited them. At the time, they had no idea that this was going to be a case that would haunt them for a long time to come. After a few nerve-wracking minutes, they finally arrived on the scene where the locals had reported the finding. Their worst fears were confirmed. There, partially clothed in an advanced state of decomposition, was the body of a man. Despite the decay, the deputies could tell that he was a white male adult. But beyond that, they had no idea who he was or how he had ended up in the river. The sheriff's deputies couldn't believe what they were seeing, and their emotions were hard to contain. They immediately took the body out of the water and carefully searched the clothing, looking for any shred of evidence that could help identify the deceased, but their efforts were fruitless. There was no form of identification, no belongings, and nothing that could help them piece together the victim's identity. Following this, the body was removed from the area and transported to the coroner's office for further examination. The findings from the autopsy that was conducted were disheartening, but it gave detectives a starting point. The coroner's report revealed that the man had possibly drowned and that he had been in the water for a month before his recovery. Detectives felt a sense of urgency as they tried to piece together the mystery surrounding the man they had found in the river. They knew that they had to find out who he was before they could unravel the events leading up to his death. They were certain that someone out there was missing a loved one, and they were determined to find out who this man had been. The detectives worked tirelessly and released a description of the man to the public, hoping to spark someone's memory of a missing person report. Days turned into weeks, but despite their best efforts, they came up empty-handed. The case was proving to be a tough nut to crack, but the detectives refused to give up hope. They knew that one piece of information could be the key to unlocking the mystery, and they were willing to pursue every lead until they found the truth. A glimmer of hope appeared when the California Department of Justice recovered a single latent fingerprint from the body. This was then sent to the automated latent print system for analysis. The detectives held their breath, hoping for a breakthrough. But when the results came back negative, their hopes were dashed once again. Undeterred by this setback, the detectives obtained the man's DNA profile, which they entered into various databases, including the California Missing Persons DNA Database and the National Unidentified Persons DNA Index. They scoured the databases hoping for any sign of a match, but their efforts were once again in vain. With each passing year, the mystery of the man's identity remained unsolved. The detectives assigned to the case refused to give up. They were determined to unravel the truth behind the unknown individual found in the Eel River. After 24 long years towards the end of 2022, a break in the case finally appeared on the horizon. Toward the end of 2022, the sheriff's office partnered with a forensic genealogy company called Othram, which is based in Texas. The partnership aimed to use advanced forensic DNA testing to finally give the unknown man his identity. A sample of the man's DNA was sent to the lab where a team of experts began analyzing it with great care and attention to detail. They used forensic-grade genome sequencing, an advanced technique that enabled them to build a complete DNA profile of the man. With the profile in hand, their genealogy team then applied forensic genetic genealogy to produce investigative leads. This innovative approach combined DNA testing with traditional genealogical methods to create family history profiles. By studying the genetic makeup of individuals and their families, researchers could determine whether they were biologically related, and this helped them to ultimately identify the man who had remained a mystery for so long. In mid-February of 2023, after months of anxious waiting, the authorities finally received the much-awaited news from Othram. The report from the lab revealed that there was a high probability that the man who had remained unidentified for decades was none other than Jeffrey Todd Saito, born in 1963. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The report also revealed that the man had several living relatives, including a possible sister named Cheryl, who was residing in Missouri. Detectives decided to leave no stone unturned. They knew that they had to be certain, and so they searched their records for fingerprints of Jeffrey and meticulously compared them to the latent print recovered all those years ago. It was a painstaking task, but their diligence paid off. The fingerprints were a match. The detectives finally had definitive proof that the man they had been trying to identify for 25 years was indeed Jeffrey. Following this, they immediately reached out to Jeffrey's sister, Cheryl. She was shocked when she received the call from them. As it turned out, she had been searching for her brother for years, and the news brought her both relief and sadness. Cheryl told the detectives that Jeffrey had cut off contact with the family years ago, and they had not heard from him since the mid-1990s. Despite her attempts to find him over the years, she had no luck locating him. The family had never reported him missing, as they had thought his disappearance was intentional. The revelation by Cheryl about her long-lost brother, Jeffrey, only added to the mystery surrounding his death. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. However, amidst the confusion, the detectives found solace in the fact that they finally succeeded in identifying the man whose true identity had eluded them for so many years. Bellingham is a charming city in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. It is located in the state of Washington, and it is 18 miles south of the Canadian border. And it is here that our next case begins. Records reveal that Wendy Aug was born on February 15, 1958. Beyond this detail, much of Wendy's early life is not known. However, what is certain is that in 1978, she was a 29-year-old single mother residing in Bellingham with her daughter Charlena. In addition to being a devoted mother, Wendy Aug was a student at McDonald's Beauty School in Bellingham. Perhaps Wendy saw her education as a pathway to a brighter future for herself and her daughter. Whatever her motivation, it's clear that she was a woman of determination and resilience. On April 24, 1987, Wendy's daily routine was interrupted as she stepped out of her beauty school in Bellingham and made her way to La Paloma restaurant across the street to get lunch. The city was alive with the promise of spring, and Wendy likely savored the chance to step away from her studies and enjoy a moment of relaxation. When Wendy returned to her beauty school after lunch, she had some exciting news to share with her classmates. She recounted a chance encounter with a man named Mike Johnson whom she had met at La Paloma restaurant. Wendy described how Mike had been wearing a sharp three-piece suit and how she had been instantly drawn to his charm and wit. She further revealed that she was planning to go on a date with him later that day. As the sun began to set that evening, Wendy left her daughter in the care of a trusted babysitter and set out to meet Mike for their first date. Her mind was undoubtedly filled with anticipation and excitement. After all, it's not every day that a chance encounter leads to a romantic evening out. As the night progressed, Wendy and Mike found themselves growing more and more comfortable with each other's company. After the date, they ended up at the home of one of Wendy's friends, where they chatted and laughed until the early hours of the morning. Eventually, they decided it was time to call it a night and headed out into the darkness. Little did anyone know that it would be the last time Wendy would be seen alive. The babysitter, who had been caring for Wendy's daughter, was the first to get worried, as Wendy had failed to come home and collect her little girl as planned. As the hours ticked by with no word from Wendy, anxiety began to give way to fear. Something was definitely not right. With no other options left, the babysitter contacted the police and reported Wendy missing. The police acted quickly and arrived at Wendy's home, hoping to find some evidence or leads that would help them locate her. Once inside, they began to search the house. As they made their way to her bedroom, they found something that chilled them to the bone. There were 2 pools of drying blood at the head of Wendy's bed, and the bedsheet was soaked in blood. But that wasn't all. There was another curious stain on the sheet, one that they couldn't immediately identify. It was clear that something violent had happened in the house, and the mystery of Wendy's disappearance had taken a dark turn. After discovering the gruesome scene in Wendy's bedroom, detectives quickly sprang into action. They reached out to her circle of friends for any information they could get, and it was through these interviews that detectives learned about Mike, the man Wendy had gone out on a date with. As they dug deeper, they found out that Mike had worked at La Paloma restaurant as a bartender for 2 days before vanishing with stolen cash and liquor. It was strange that Mike's disappearance coincided with Wendy's. Even more peculiar was that he was seen driving her vehicle, a 1972 Ford Torino. The detectives knew they had to track down Mike as soon as possible. They were hot on the trail of Mike, and it didn't take them long to uncover a lead. They learned that a man had been seen entering the United States from Canada in Wendy's car a day after Mike disappeared from Bellingham. The United States Customs authorities had even snapped a photo of the man, and he got the description of Mike. Just hours after the photo was taken, Wendy's car was discovered abandoned in Eugene, Oregon. The vehicle was searched, and authorities made a shocking discovery. They found a pair of bloodied men's pants. In addition to this, they also found a Burger King hamburger box which they were able to lift a fingerprint from. Much to the surprise of detectives, analysis of the fingerprint revealed that it belonged to a man named Darren D. O'Neill, who was a notorious criminal with a long list of offenses which included robbery and assault. The detectives quickly realized that Mike was likely an alias used by O'Neill. To confirm their suspicions, they obtained the job application that Mike had submitted to La Paloma restaurant and ran it for fingerprints. Their hunch was proven correct when the fingerprints matched O'Neill's, leaving no doubt that he was indeed the man who had gone by the name Mike and was last seen with Wendy. The authorities were determined to find O'Neill, but he seemed to have slipped away without a trace. He was also hard to track down because he was often changing his name and appearance. It wasn't until months later, in September 1987, that detectives finally got their break. O'Neill was apprehended in Florida on a stolen car warrant. Upon his arrest, he was then extradited to Washington State, where he faced charges for his heinous crimes. One of those charges was for the murder of 21-year-old Pierce County woman Robin Smith. Robin had gone missing just 4 weeks before Wendy, and her body was found in May of 1987. Despite being questioned about Wendy's whereabouts, O'Neill refused to give any information. 2 years later, in 1989, he pleaded guilty to Robin's murder and was sentenced to life in prison. But that wasn't all. O'Neill was also convicted of second-degree auto theft for stealing Wendy's car, providing a small measure of closure for her family and friends. The horrors of O'Neill continued to come to light as another victim's story emerged. In August 1990, he was convicted for the crime of kidnapping and committing unspeakable atrocities to a 14-year-old Portland girl back in 1987. The jury's verdict was swift and decisive, and O'Neill was sentenced to 135 years in prison for this case alone. O'Neill's incarceration no doubt brought some measure of justice. However, his silence around Wendy's disappearance was deafening. No one knew if she was still alive, and if not, where her body could be found. Despite efforts by the authorities and Wendy's family and friends, the mystery surrounding her disappearance remained unsolved. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, and the community could only wonder and speculate about what could have happened to her. As the years went by, the hope of finding Wendy alive dwindled, and the search for her body became the only thing left. The Bellingham Police Department had long given up hope of solving Wendy's mysterious disappearance in 1987. But in 2015, they received a startling report from the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory about evidence found at Wendy's home that could potentially crack the case wide open. Detectives had seen a suspicious stain on Wendy's bedsheet all those years ago, but it wasn't until now that it was confirmed to be a semen stain. The DNA extracted from stain was used to create a profile, and the results were final. The profile matched none other than O'Neill, the man already serving a life sentence for other crimes. It seemed that after all these years, justice might finally be served for Wendy. In November 2020, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory once again informed detectives about another development. It was about the pair of men's pants that had been found in Wendy's car after it was abandoned by O'Neill. What was discovered was that the blood found on the pair of pants belonged to none other than Wendy herself. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, it became undeniable that O'Neill had a hand in Wendy's disappearance and likely death. Finally, in October 2022, the authorities made their move. They charged him with the second-degree murder of Wendy and set his bail at an astonishing $10 million. On March 1, 2023, O'Neill was extradited to Washington from Oregon, where he was serving a 135-year prison term. On March 10, 2023, he appeared before the Whatcom County Superior Court. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he pleaded not guilty, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. O'Neill's public defense attorney, Stark Follis, also argued that the long gap between the alleged murder and the charges being laid should be taken into consideration. Additionally, Follis questioned why O'Neill was not charged with Aug's murder back in 1987, when he was charged with stealing her car. At the moment, O'Neill's next appearance is scheduled for April 5, 2023, leaving many to wonder what the future holds for the case. Specialist Enrique Roman Martinez was a paratrooper and human resource specialist assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in North Carolina in May of 2020. The 21-year-old was from Chino, California, and had two older sisters. His mother, Maria, raised her 3 children largely on her own and worked 2 jobs to support them. Enrique had joined the Army at the age of 17 despite concerns held by his family. He was aware of the potential risks, but hoped that his time serving his country would instill discipline and responsibility in him, as well as provide him with the means to eventually attend college. He had a difficult time following his father's deportation when Enrique was just 11 years old, and eventually, his grades started to suffer. Enrique believed that the character development and college Army his service, including the Army Good Conduct Medal and the National Defense Service Medal. Enrique had been a shy child who became more social as he grew up, but he was still somewhat of an introvert. It took some time for him to open up to others, but he was quick to cheer up anyone who was feeling down. He was somewhat of a homebody, liking to stay home and play video games. As a result of his sweet and caring nature, he did not like confrontation. For Memorial Day weekend of 2020, Enrique went camping with 7 other soldiers, 6 men and 1 woman, on South Corbanks, a small island off the coast of North Carolina that is a part of the Cape Lookout National Seashore. He was last seen alive at their campsite near mile marker 46 just before midnight on Friday. At 7 p.m. the following day, 19 hours after Enrique was last seen, one of the other soldiers he had been camping with called 911 to report him missing. The other campers claimed that Enrique had walked away from their campsite just before midnight wearing nothing but a pair of blue shorts. Enrique's phone, wallet, eyeglasses, and other belongings were all found at the campsite. The soldier who called 911 told the dispatcher that they had gone to bed at 12:03 a.m. Saturday morning and that Enrique was still gone when they woke up. And when was the last time you saw him? So we all went to bed at 12:03, and that is the last time he saw him. The caller also told the dispatcher that the group had spent all day looking for Enrique and trying to find park rangers to ask for help without success. When we woke up, he was not here. We've been looking for him all day. We were trying to find the park ranger or their offices or anything. However, there was a problem with this assertion. Between 1 and 2 p.m., the group had been approached by 2 park rangers who asked them to move their vehicles, which were illegally parked too close to the sand dunes. The rangers were clearly rangers, dressed in park ranger uniforms and driving marked vehicles. The group agreed to move their cars, but no one in the group informed the park rangers that a member of their party was missing. The caller also claimed that he had reason to believe that Enrique had harmed himself. "We might be afraid that he might have hurt himself, or we're really not sure. He wasn't diagnosed, but he did have suicidal tendencies." Enrique's family vehemently denied this claim. Enrique's sister, Griselda, has said that the tone of her conversations with her brother had changed over the previous year, but this change was because Enrique was focused on his future plans with his family, not because he no longer wanted to have a future. Enrique had been unhappy living in North Carolina because he was anxious to return home to his family and begin the next chapter of his life. He was less than a year away from completing his service with the Army. He was scheduled to receive a medical discharge because he suffered from chronic compartment syndrome in his legs, a condition which limited his ability to run for long distances. He had the option of undergoing surgery to try to correct the problem, but the success of such a surgery was not guaranteed. Enrique planned to instead take the medical discharge and move back to California to be with his family and use his military benefits to enroll in college, where he wanted to study pharmacology and psychology. He hoped to one day have a career providing medical treatments for individuals suffering from mental illness. He also had a more short-term dream of taking a trip to Japan with his sister Griselda. Enrique had already made plans to move in with Griselda when he returned to California. He had talked to her just 2 days before he went missing, and the siblings had discussed how they would set up his bedroom and what kind of car he wanted to buy when he got back to California. While it can be argued that Enrique's family was not qualified to declare him free of any serious mental illness, the same amount of skepticism should be applied to the other soldiers' ability to diagnose Enrique as suicidal. Griselda and her mother, Maria, traveled to North Carolina as soon as they heard that Enrique was missing. When they arrived at South Core Banks, they became even more convinced that Enrique had not simply wandered off into the night. There were no wooded areas or dense vegetation that could have hidden Enrique in the immediate area where he was last seen. According to Park Ranger Nate Toring, it is very difficult to get lost on the island for a long period of time without some sort of extenuating circumstance because of the island's geography. While the island is 26 miles long, it is very narrow with little interior land to disappear into. Enrique's family was alarmed by the fact that he had left the campsite without his glasses. He could not see without them and would have had an even more difficult time without them while it was dark outside. A massive search was launched for Enrique. Ocean and nearby sounds were also searched. The Army Criminal Investigation Command, the Coast Guard, the North Carolina Marine Patrol, the K-9 team from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, and the Carteret County Sheriff's Office were all a part of the search. Unfortunately, few clues were found over the following several days. On May 29th, partial human remains washed ashore on Shackleford Banks, another barrier island just west of South Core Banks. They were sent to the medical examiner's office, and a week later, it was confirmed that the remains were of Enrique. His dental records were used to make the identification. The medical examiner's office ruled Enrique's death a homicide, and the Army Criminal Investigation Command is investigating it as such. They are currently offering a $25,000 reward for information that leads to the apprehension and conviction of Enrique's killer or killers. Because of their investigation, Army CID has released very little information about the case to the public in order to protect any possible future prosecution of whoever killed Enrique. Unfortunately, this also means that they have had to leave Enrique's family without many answers as well. An unnamed Army official did tell ABC News that there is no suspicion that the murder was a reprisal or hate crime. The medical examiner's office also told that her brother's injuries were consistent with dismemberment rather than with coming in contact with a boat propeller or wildlife after he was the water. There is not an animal in that sea that could have done that, she was told. While Army CID cannot provide them with information right now, Enrique's family believes that they are working diligently on Enrique's case. They also suspect that they may have a person of interest in the case, but not enough evidence to make an arrest. They have therefore been very active in the media, imploring anyone with information to come forward. Given the inconsistencies and problems with the account provided by the other soldiers Enrique was camping with, it seems most likely that a big break in the case will come from one of them providing a more complete statement. However, they are not the only potential witnesses. Because it was a holiday weekend, South Core Banks was very busy at the time Enrique went missing. Park Ranger Nate Turing estimates that there were thousands of visitors to the island that weekend, any number of whom could have seen something that they did not realize was important at the time. According to his family's religious beliefs, Enrique's soul will not be at peace until his killer has been found. Enrique's mother, Maria, is too distraught to even sleep, and his sister Griselda is both haunted and pushed onward in her quest for justice by a conversation she had with Enrique many years before his death. He asked me one time, "Will you always be there to protect me?" I said yes, Griselda recounted. Now that it's happened, it breaks my heart. I feel guilty that I couldn't protect him. The most I can do is find out what happened to him. Late in the evening of January 27, 2002, 29-year-old Jim Springer Jr. called home to his wife, Jenny, from the AMF Broadway Bowl on South Broadway in Littleton, Colorado, where he was the new assistant manager. Jim had been born in Connecticut and raised in Utah. He had been given several options of locations to work at for AMF. He had been offered positions in New York and in Salt Lake City, but because of the recent attacks in the former city and the upcoming Olympic Games being held in the latter, he did not believe that they would be safe places for him, Jenny, and their two small children to live. Therefore, he moved the family to Colorado so he could accept the position in Littleton. He had begun his new position there less than 2 months earlier, on December 3, 2001. Jim told Jenny that he had finished closing up the bowling alley for the night. He was waiting for Erin's ride to arrive, and he would be giving Bobby a ride before coming home. Erin was 26-year-old Erin Gola. She was a graduate of Bear Creek High School and the mother of 2 young children. She worked as a snack bar manager at the bowling alley. Bobby was 23-year-old Bobby Zias. He was an employee at the AMF bowling alley in Highlands Ranch, but spent a lot of time at Broadway Bowl to be with friends he had there. He had loved bowling since he was a child and had bowled multiple perfect games. He had been going through a difficult time recently following the end of a long-term relationship, but was looking forward to starting his new job with the Colorado Department of Transportation and considering going to school to get a degree in accounting. Erin had called a friend to get a ride home after closing. At 11:50 that night, Erin's ride was waiting for her outside of the bowling alley when she saw a bald man wearing a trench coat exiting the building. When Erin did not come outside, her friend decided to go into the bowling alley to see what was causing the delay. Inside, she found Jim, Erin, and Bobby. They had all been shot and killed. The murders occurred during a robbery. The safe had been opened and emptied. The bowling alley had been robbed once weeks earlier, but no one had been killed during that crime. Erin's friend was able to help develop a sketch of the man she had seen leaving the bowling alley. The sketch was distributed, but no one came identifying the man in the sketch. Several months after the murders, Erin's name came up in relation to different crimes. She was found to have connections to a methamphetamine ring that was the subject of a grand jury investigation. Her exact connection to the individuals involved was never fully established because she could not be interviewed as a part of the investigation. These connections could, of course, be purely despite ongoing media attention. Despite ongoing media attention. In 2015, Jim, Erin, and Bobby were each individually featured in a set of playing cards distributed in Colorado prisons by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Each card in the deck's the victim of a cold case along with information about their case. The playing card program was started in hopes that the cases would reach inmates who may have knowledge of who committed the crimes and be willing to cooperate. Metro Denver Crime Stoppers is offering a reward of up to $2,000 in the case, which remains unsolved. Galen Rose was the proud mother of 4 daughters: Kiana Davis, 11, Kiara Phillips, 9, Carrie L. McDonald, 7, and Keeney Welsh, 5. The family lived in the small town of Flora, Indiana. Galen had relocated the family to Flora from Missouri after her father, Tracy, moved there for work. They lived with Tracy for several months while they got settled and then moved into an apartment a few blocks away on East Columbia Street. The apartment was in a house that had been converted into 2 separate units. Kiana loved adventure, and Cariel was feisty and loved to make others smile. Kiani and Kiera were both a little more quiet. All 4 of the sisters were members of the Lafayette Diamonds cheerleading squad. They spent November 19, 2016 in South Bend, Indiana for a cheer competition, and the following day, Kiana, who had hopes of one day being a star player in high school, had a basketball game. In the early morning hours of that Monday, November 21, 2016, a fire broke out in the family's apartment. The unit had no working smoke detectors to alert them of the danger, but Galen was awoken by the smoke. She fought desperately to get into her daughter's bedrooms but was pushed back by thick black smoke. Injured, she went outside to try to find another way to get to the girls, who were trapped in their rooms by flames and screaming for help. Upon his arrival at the scene, Carroll County Sheriff's Deputy Drew Yoder entered the burning structure to try to save the girls. Because Flora was such a small community, he was familiar with the family. He knew Galen from the gas station where she worked. She would always smile, ask about his day, and tell him to be safe as he left. He often saw the girls outside their home rescue the girls. Deputy Yoder was seriously injured. Rescue the girls. Deputy Yoder was seriously injured. He was pulled from the building by Florida police officer Josh Dissinger, who was also injured in the process. Galen was outside screaming for her girls, unable to find a way to help them. For a while, the girls could be heard screaming back to her, but eventually all 4 girls stopped screaming. All 4 of the sisters died of asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation. Galen was airlifted to a hospital in Indianapolis, where she remained for several days receiving treatment for her injuries. Deputy Yoder was taken to a burn unit in Fort Wayne and Officer Dissinger was treated at a hospital in Lafayette. The home was severely damaged by the fire, and officials were initially unable to determine the cause of it. They speculated that it may have been in the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, which has jurisdiction over the Indiana State Fire Marshal, announced that the fire had been set intentionally. The fire was ruled an arson because accelerant was found in several areas inside the home. A 2018 peer review by the Indianapolis Fire also confirmed the determination. An arsonist would have had access to the home because the back door could not be locked. Galen had reported the problem to her landlord 2 weeks before the fire, but it had not been fixed. This was one of many major issues with the residents that were outlined in a lawsuit filed by Galen in 2018 against her landlords and their holding company. The main premise of the suit is that by not installing functioning smoke detectors, as required by Indiana state law, the landlords contributed to the girls' deaths. They did not start the fire, but prevented the girls from waking up in time to escape the burning home before the fire spread, trapping them inside. The lawsuit also alleges that the landlords failed to provide a habitable residence, leaving the back door and several dangerous electrical outlets unrepaired and not completing work on the leaking kitchen ceiling. The lawsuit is ongoing. The arson determination was not without controversy, however. A local private investigator who consulted on the fire disagreed with the findings, and state arson investigator Dennis Randall, who had been working on the case, subsequently resigned in June of 2017. His son, Adam Randall, resigned as the fire chief in Florida 5 months later. With so much instability in the investigation, the local NAACP chapter has raised concerns that the entire investigation may have been bungled. The entire town of Florida has rallied behind Galen and the memory of her girls. Every church in the greater Florida area, as well as several local businesses, contributed to supporting Galen with meals and other material concerns after the fire. 2 local funeral homes joined together to provide a memorial service for the girls. The small community has raised more than $21,000 for a reward in the case, in part through creating and selling a cookbook dedicated to the 4 sisters known as Flora's 4 Angels. On the 2nd anniversary of the fire, investigators claimed that they had solid persons of interest in the case, but no arrests have ever been made, and whoever set the fire that took the lives of the 4 sisters has not yet been brought to justice. Galen Rose and her father, Tracy, have since left Flora, moving to California, where Galen is in therapy to try to cope with her unimaginable loss. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.